Okay.
Hey.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Chabura. I hope your fast was easy and successful. For those who are here for the first time, we are an online Bet Midrash comprised of international students offering cutting-edge Torah for you to learn anytime, anywhere. Just a note to say that if you're watching or hearing this public shoot on YouTube or podcast, we have a whole range of exclusive classes for our members that are not publicly available. In order to access these members-only classes, you can become a member at thechabura.com/join. I'll put that link in the chat box. There you'll discover the benefits of becoming a Chabura member, which includes a unique curriculum of classes in video and podcast form, a free book shipped to you each year, the opportunity to write for our journals and books, and to connect with hundreds of like-minded individuals from over 20 countries. We don't make profit from any of our projects, so we appreciate the support of our members in ensuring the Chabura continues to provide cutting-edge Torah to a global audience. So if you enjoy what we're doing at the Chabura, please consider becoming a member today in time for our new curriculum beginning in September. Visit our website to find out more. Moving on to tonight. Tonight we have the privilege of having a conversation between our very special Rosh Bet Midrash, Senior Rabbi Joseph Dweck, and the extremely impressive and insightful Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens, who is a professor of philosophy and fortunately for us is no stranger to the Chabura. Tonight, we will be discussing the foundational problem of evil and suffering. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And with that, I will hand it over to Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. As always, thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And thank you to Yedidi v'Chabibi Kevavat Eini, Reb Sam Lebens, for taking the time to be able to share on the Chabura and to speak about such fundamental issues, which we're going to, I wonder if we will barely even scratch the surface in the short period of time that we have, because these are, hovkot zroot olam, as they say. These are big issues, and you raised them. Again, this wasn't my choice. This is Rabbi Sam's choice. But I'm happy to go along for the ride, wherever.
Well, I had an agenda, you see, on behalf of the Chabura, because I will be teaching a course of three sessions. I can't remember exactly when it is, after the summer, on the problem of evil. So I'm hoping to whet people's appetites. I'm hoping, that we leave people with lots of questions. They want to come back for more.
Well, that I'm sure we'll be able to do. Answers, I don't know, not so much, but maybe some questions. We'll do our best. But whatever it is, the process and the journey of discussion with you was always exhilarating and a privilege. So I'm happy to be able to be here and do it with you. So take it away. Which direction do you want to go in? Where are we headed?
Well, in a sense, there are questions that I think would be interesting for me to put to you, Rabbi Dweck, because I have smicha, but I almost have it by accident, because if you stay put in yeshiva long enough, you end up, you find you have one. But I don't work as a rabbi. I work as a professor in the philosophy department, and the only things I do with a rabbinic hat on, sometimes I have the privilege of teaching shiurim. And I get to officiate at weddings, which is really nice. But I don't do funerals, and I do bikkur cholim when God forbid my friends are unwell. But I don't have the pastoral responsibilities that you have. And therefore, I think there's a sense in which you face the problem of evil as a more tangible, concrete phenomenon. I sit in the ivory tower and I think about the problem of evil. I can help explain for those here as to what that problem is philosophically. But I don't think it's always the case that what satisfies somebody philosophically necessarily satisfies their heart, right? And necessarily kind of satisfies them existentially. You may have all sorts of explanations for why pain and suffering happen in the world, but it might not be all that compassionate to engage in those who study Daf Yomi. We're in Masechet Ketubot at the moment, and there's this interesting Agadata where Reish Lakish comes to a shiva, and he gets his maturgaman to kind of give comfort, and it's not at all comforting. On first,
Reish Lakish wasn't great at that in general. But.
Yeah, with something like, well, people get punished for their sins, so people die young, or something like that.
Which is the classic line, that's certainly one prominent strand when it comes to the question of suffering in Torah, and certainly in rabbinic literature, that it's almost always, although the Bavli certainly takes a turn, but I think that it's almost always connected to suffering. Certainly the Bible primes us, right? Tanakh primes us to think of things that way. So Rish Lakish saying that. Rish Lakish was not an easy guy. He didn't even he wouldn't speak to anybody that was from Bavel because he was upset that they never came back, to Eretz Israel. So he had his own way of doing things. But no, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I don't think by any means that you're in an ivory tower. And I would have to say that I am, you say that you're a rabbi almost by accident. If I'm involved in philosophy at all, it's almost by accident. So we probably balance each other. But the point that you're raising of the pastoral experience, I suppose, in which there's these intersections of life that happen. I remember when I started as a rabbi very young. I was 23 years old, and I remember the first time that I got a call that somebody died, and it was my first call, and I had to hang up and got another call that somebody just had a baby. And these were in the period of 3 minutes, it was very, very, and so for a 23-year-old rabbi, I thought, well, oh my, how am I supposed to deal with this? And it was then that I realized that the cycle of life just goes. And, if you find your intersection with it, there's a question in which, how do I practically engage when a person is crying on the phone that his wife just died and he doesn't know what to do? So that point that you're making, I think, is an important point in general. But it doesn't take a rabbi, right? In other words, you living life, me living life, all of these people here and everyone we know living life, because we are alive and human, will experience suffering. It's one of my favorite passages in the Talmud, actually, where Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan, interesting, is always around, very often around the discussions of suffering in the Talmud, but he stands up for a 70-year-old Gentile, or a Gentile that he knows is over 70. You know the story, of course, and the students ask him, why are you standing up? It's a Gentile, thinking that maybe there should be some wisdom. And his response is simply, if he's lived 70 years on this earth, he knows suffering, and that has taught him. And the wisdom that he acquires from that we stand for, right? So that's part of our human condition, and it's something that touches all of us. So yes, it's an important thing to kind of talk out and unpack, but I hear that.
Right.
Yeah.
And that, what you touch on is what Rabbi Yochanan is assuming there, that suffering plays a role in shaping a human being, and teaching a human being, is a key element of many philosophical responses to the problem of evil. You're right.
It's another strand, right?
Another strand, right? So one strand, you could call it the punitive strand, which you really see in the Tanakh. That it seems as if when bad things happen, there's always a reason, because in a sense we always deserve it. It's a response for sin, but on the other hand, the Tanakh itself has multiple voices on this. So Yecheskel comes along and says, God forbid a person should be punished for the sins of their ancestors, which seems to be completely against the pshat of Sefer Vayikra and Sefer Dvarim, and Sefer Shemot in the Yud Gimel Midot of Hashem, where it looks like in the Chumash, no, the Jewish people, we have collective responsibility for one another, and sometimes that means that righteous people will suffer alongside the wicked because of the collective fate of Am Yisrael. And then Yecheskel comes along and says, no, that's not right. That's for Chalila. That should be. Yeah. We all suffer for our individual sins. And then you see, hold on a minute. Sometimes people, I think we should all be open to the possibility that, the Gemara in Masechet Brachot says, if suffering comes upon you, the first thing you should do is inspect your own deeds.
What you're doing. Yeah,
and now that's an important point. It doesn't say inspect other people's deeds.
That's right.
There's a nice story about Rav Yisrael Salant during one of the cholera epidemics that swept across Europe and much of the world. People were saying, it's happened because of Chilul Shabbat, or it's happening because of it's happening because of people aren't, they're not machmir on this mitzvah, or it's because of this aveira, it's because of this. And Rabbi Yisrael Salant said, well, maybe it's happening as a punishment for our blaming people for the magifah, right?
That's so Rabbi Yisrael Salant
exactly.
to say, but yes,
start
it's
with yourself,
it's a very
right?
important point, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, it's an important point, because whenever people say, what am I doing? I point out that Gemara. It's always yifashvish b'ma'asav, right?
Yeah.
You got to look in. What can I do?
To yourself.
And that's another rabbi thing, because oftentimes the rabbis asked. And even when they're not asked, they offer the suggestions. But even when a rabbi is asked, it's important to guide back to yifashvish b'ma'asav in whatever way that might be.
But there are times where we recognize, and even that Gemara recognizes that. I mean, there's actually, I think there's a subtle irony in that Gemara, because the Gemara continues and says, and if you can't,
what if you don't find anything?
If you don't find anything, it says, it's probably because you were Mevatel Torah, right? So look at your, and I think there's a subtle point there, which is that if you think that you are completely clean of Aveirot, completely clean of sins, you really need to learn more Torah. Because if you do, you'll recognize you probably weren't. We all have things that we're responsible for. We all have the less positive side of our biographies to take account of. But nonetheless, the Gemara does recognize after that we can't account for all of the pain and suffering that we see in this world in terms of just deserved. Because God forbid, lo aleinu, but we see children suffering, children who simply can't carry the weight of responsibility that could be in any way proportionate to the pain and suffering that they experience, or righteous martyrs. We read about the martyrs of the Hadrianic persecutions on Yom Kippur. To say that the pain and suffering that they went through was at all commensurate with we could call it just desert. This means that you're going to find among thinking Jewish people across the generations other attempts to answer the problem of evil, other than punitive. And you see, in the Moreh Nevuchim, there's discussion of the problem of evil. The Ramban has an extensive discussion of the problem of evil in Torah Adam, which is an interesting thing, because it's a halachic book, Torah Adam. It's all about the halachot of mourning and burial and death. But then he has his whole philosophy. It's very much in line with the Chabura, which is that you can't divorce these different areas of Torah. So he has a whole chapter about but why does death happen, and why do good people die young, and etc. So you're going to see among thinking Jews of all generations attempts to respond to this theological problem of evil, and I suppose having started in a circuitous route, we've already spoken about some solutions. We should just express the problem in its clearest form. The clearest form, I like to think of the problem as having three forms, right? The first form is called the logical problem of evil, which says that if God existed, he would be powerful enough to get rid of all evil, good enough to want to get rid of all evil, and knowledgeable enough to know how to do it. It's supposed to follow directly that if such a God exists, there would be no evil. And there is evil, pain and suffering around us. And therefore it's supposed to follow without further ado that God doesn't exist, or at least God so described, right? You can end up with a weak God, or an unknowing God, or an uncaring God, but the God that we believe in of absolute perfection is supposed to be ruled out logically. There is the evidential problem of evil. The evidential problem of evil says, no, it's not impossible. Maybe there's some explanation as to why an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God would allow the pattern of suffering and evil that we see around us, but it is at least counter-evidence to the existence of God. Not a proof that God doesn't exist, but counter-evidence. And the third problem is the one I started with by pushing it back on you, Rabbi Dweck, is this idea of the existential problem of evil, which is that even if it can make sense to you intellectually, you've read all the books and you've read the Ramban on Sefer Eov, that's another great place, or you've read the Rav Sadia Gaon on Sefer Eov, and intellectually you feel you have some grasp. If it doesn't make sense in one's heart, when one is confronted with evil and pain and suffering. Although I would just point out, and I say I'm not a pastoral rabbi, but in response to the existential problem, if you experience, in response to pain and suffering, anger, if you feel angry at God, then that's quite a holy thing to feel, because it suggests that you're not an atheist. Atheists don't feel angry at God, right? Or if you feel abandoned by God in times of pain and suffering. Those are actually religious responses to pain and suffering, because they suggest that deep down you have a faith.
I mean, we certainly find the latter, if not the former. I think we find the former as well, but we certainly find the latter even in Scripture. You know,
yes.
Eli Eli lama azavtani, and very oftentimes in the Tehillim, you know, where there's this question of please don't leave me.
That's right. Al ta'azveni. I find that in the High Holy Liturgy, in the Yomim Noraim, you know, Al ta'azveni, it's just very, very, don't abandon me, O Lord, right?
Absolutely.
And the notion of being left to one's own, devices outside of the shelter of divine protection is just...
It's very much a central aspect of Jewish thought.
Yeah, and the experience of pain. But like I said, an atheist doesn't feel that. Richard Dawkins isn't walking around saying, "Oh God, why have you abandoned me?" Right?
No, he's alleviated that problem, hasn't he?
Yeah. So those are the problems, and we that's the problem. Sorry, and we spoke about the punitive side, and I think that as theists we have to recognize that at least some pain and suffering may well be just deserved. Some, but to say it for all pain and suffering is a stretch. And you mentioned Rabbi Yochanan speaking about his respect for an elderly person because he would have been my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, was very, very fond of a book by C.S. Lewis called The Problem of Pain. And he was very much of the belief that people should spend the time to look at that book. It's a book by a Christian theologian, but nonetheless, it addresses this problem that faces all monotheists, of the Abrahamic traditions, and the book, doesn't, unlike some of C.S. Lewis's other works, it doesn't engage in anything distinctively Christian. It's in anything that a Jew would be kind of forbidden from thinking or saying. And he has this amazing mashal about a sculptor carving the forms of men, and how each blow of the chisel hurts us so much, but it's part of what goes towards making us perfect. He had this other metaphor, C.S. Lewis. He said that pain is God's megaphone to rouse a sleeping world. And I find this very powerful. He said, but why couldn't God wake us up with something more pleasant, like violins or laughter? And he said, well, because the dream from which we need to be awakened is the dream that all is well. It's a very, very powerful.
I appreciate the second one more than the first.
Yeah.
Not to break analogies down. I mean,
tell me why. No, I like breaking analogies.
Not just that they're analogies, but the first one is problematic because you could always use anesthesia. Right. In other words, when you're acting the blows, you can do it without anesthesia. You can do it with or without anesthesia, unless the pain itself is what is forming the entity, right? So, which I think we at the end of the day have to get to, because I think that's what Rabbi Yochanan is kind of pointing out over there when he says what's happening with this elderly person. He says the harpatke, right? These vicissitudes.
Yes.
In and of themselves are the educational means, or they are the means of refinement, if you will, or whatever word we use to kind of.
And you could ask, why did it have to be painful?
Yes, well, I that's why I'm saying I think the pain itself, it's in the very pain, right? Which is a question to unpack which is a question to unpack. Yeah.
But
I think it's something. It's a subtlety, but I think an important one. Yeah, because one could talk about chiseling and forming and so on, and it hurts to chisel and form, and so it's a byproduct. Whereas I think it's important to recognize that I think the pain is not a byproduct, right? And if we're looking at it again in that framework, right? If we're looking at the suffering as a mode of growth, development, and incidentally, I'll share one thing, one reading, because there's a Gemara in Shabbat which says that Rabbi Ameh, he makes a very bold statement, which in the end the Gemara refutes. But Rabbi Ameh says, the famous en mita belo chet ve'en yisurin belo avon. And so the Gemara in the end refutes that point, right? Which I'll translate, for those who right? There's no death without misstep or transgression, and there's no suffering without iniquity, right? That's a rough translation, but it's in the translation of the word that actually I wanted to. I have a reading of it that is perhaps connects kind of to what we're saying over here, because it says in Yisurim B'Lavon, and the simple reading of that is again back to if there's no sin, there's no suffering.
No suffering.
But I think the word avon is chosen carefully. I want to suggest anyway that the word avon is chosen carefully, that avon comes from ivut in Hebrew, which means that there's something corrupt, right? Something that needs to be unpacked, untangled, worked out, that is not functional. And that unless there is something of that nature in the person, there's no Yisurin, right? So almost to say that if Yisurin are present, they are present to affect the untangling, to affect the growth, to affect the movement to a more whole, individuated, integral, person. Again, it's looking at it in terms of suffering qua that mode, but it's a way that I read it that I think is perhaps a bit, for me, I think that it helps to shed light on more substance with regards to understanding how to accommodate the statement of Rabbi Ameh. But I will say, I mean, I don't know that you're ready to go there, and we don't have to go there, but I'll dip into it anyway, right? We do have to talk about this idea that things happen because they happen. And even that is, and we don't have to do it now, right? No. We're not ready for it, but I'm throwing it out there because it's important to dip into as we're talking about all of this, because we are trying to square everything, aren't we? Right? We're trying to say, well, it's either sin or it's development, or it's got to be something, right? It's us trying to say there has to be some kind of reason.
Or could it just be chance?
Or is it just that it's a random world by default, and wrong things happen in unfortunate places when you're in the wrong place at the wrong time? And there's actually a Gemara. It's one of the most shocking Gemarot. But a Gemara in Chagiga, in which the angel of death says, "Look, go get me Miriam X." To his servant, and the servant brings back Miriam Y by accident. And he said, well, no, this is not the right Miriam. It's not her time to die yet. He go, how did you even get her? He go, well, there was a vulnerability. I just went for it. He's like, all right, well, we'll take her anyway. That's in the Bavli. That's
like an accident could happen in the heavenly accounting.
You don't really find that in the Yerushalmi or earlier texts. It's something that is, something presented in the Bavli, which is remarkable. And there are also texts in the Bavli where Chazal absolutely reject their suffering. In other words, if you're saying that your suffering is a result of sin, or you're saying that suffering is going to help you be a better person, why would there be these stories in Masechet Brachot in which Rabbi Yochanan again comes along?
I don't want the pain and I don't want the reward for the pain. I want nothing to do with it.
Let me get back to life.
Yeah.
Right. So that's in there as well, and I think.
Well, I think that's because there's also. So you said we're trying to square a lot of things, right? So one problem is the problem of evil. That was what was on the flyer for our conversation, right? But there's also a question about hashgacha pratit. How does God, hashgacha pratit is providence, right? So how does God care for the world? And to what extent does God manage, in the minutiae of what goes on in the world? Because on the one extreme, you have people who think, the Baal Shem Tov is reputed to have said a leaf doesn't fall from a tree right? Without
God's command, right?
Yeah, without God's command. But specifically, and I'm sure this was chosen on purpose, a leaf on a tree, that's exactly what the Rambam criticizes the mutakalimim, the Islamic philosophers. Oh, as if God dictates when any given leaf should fall from a tree. No, God set in place laws of nature, and for the Rambam, hashgacha pratit is a privilege that doesn't befall every single human being. It befalls those human beings who rise to it, who are worthy of hashgacha pratit. So it's very nice, some of us like to say, and I have my moods when I'm like this, because I have a little bit of a chassid in me. There's a little bit of me that likes to say from time to time, oh, it's b'shet, or it had to be. And you see this in the Gemara, Gamzu the Tova, it's Nachmish Gamzu. But there's another side of me that perhaps the more philosophical, sedate, and rational side says, hold on a minute, that's actually quite arrogant to think that God is like, intervening to do things for you some things are just by chance. God. In fact, the Rambam has a very moving example when he talks about hashgacha pratit in the third chelek of the Moreh Nevuchim. He talks about a shipwreck, and of course, anyone who knows about his biography knows what a meaningful example that is, because he lost his brother to a shipwreck. And he says that the way hashgacha pratit works according to Maimonides, the way that individual providence works, is that God, because for the Rambam, God is pure intellect. If God is going to interfere with the world once he's created it, it's going to be through some sort of intellectual influence, because God is pure intellect. So what God can do is he can, so to speak, broadcast a message, something like, warning, there's going to be a terrible storm at sea. And if you are refined enough to pick up that message, you don't need to be a prophet necessarily. A prophet would hear it very clearly, but you could be slightly lower. You just get some sort of strong inclination. Oh, I don't think I want to get on that boat.
Chazal referred to that as mazalo, right? Right?
Yeah, mazale yada.
Or you're unconscious.
Your
right?
unconscious knows. Your unconscious picks it up. And the Rambam's making it sound as if, his brother didn't pick that up. And it was terribly tragic. But, so yes, you're absolutely right. We've got lots of different questions to answer, and it's difficult to answer them without answering them together. Because if you have one view about providence, it's going to give you a different view about the problem of evil. Right. Truth be told, if you think that God manages things at that micro level, he's more on the hook for evil than if God is.
I think that we're saying a lot. We're saying a lot without saying explicitly that all of this, right? All of these questions, the problem of evil and the problem of suffering and the various strands of suffering that we're addressing, all really come down to a bigger question, which is that of justice, right? And what bothers us really is the justice problem.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm just putting that out there because I think
you're right.
That's the unspoken underlying foundation to all of this. It's even prompting the conversation in the first place, because we didn't worry about justice. We really wouldn't be. We would say, okay, it hurts, but what can we do? There's no justice,
But there is another strand of Jewish thought that the Ramban in Torah Adam comes down against very harshly. But it's what you could call anti-theodicy. So theodicy is the attempt to defend God in the face of the problem of evil, to explain why his ways really are just, as you said, in the face of what looks like contrary evidence. Right? I have it here. It's in the last chapter of Torah Adam. He says, "The im tish'al, if you ask, kevan sheyesh inyan ne'elam b'mishpat, v'nitzarech lahamin b'tzidko mitzad shofet ha'emet yitbarach." He says, you might ask, right? We know that God's justice is hidden from us, and we have faith that he's a perfect judge, right? So why are we going into all of this, trouble to try and explain? Just have faith. Shut up and have faith.
But what he's saying, but I think what's important is, and thank you for bringing that in. What's important is that even the Ramban is not saying, right, and not saying that you're saying this, right? I'm simply adding a point to it, right? The Ramban is saying it's not that it isn't just. You just don't get the justice.
You just don't get. But that's the question.
That's the issue, right? He's saying, okay, so you don't see the justice.
Yeah, but that's the question of the Ramban. The Ramban answers it. He says, it's like a really dumb thing to say, because he thinks that God gave us an intellect for a reason, and we have to try our hardest to figure things out. And we've got to do it with humility, recognizing that the answers we come across might not be the final answers, and the questioner is right, as you point out, to start with the faith that God is just. But that doesn't relinquish us of the responsibility to try to figure out something. Hear it out, to try. However, against the Ramban, I would say there are people in our tradition that just are anti-theodicy. And I think, that comes across when Rabbi Yochanan says, Lo hein v'lo scharan. I don't want anything to do with pain and suffering. And when you have all those midrashim where God himself is confronted about the problem of evil, and he often says things like, Shtok kachala b'machshava.
Yes, right.
Shut up, this is just the way it is. Or I'll return the world back to nothing. That's right. Which means it's as if there's a strand in the Gemara that's saying these questions are above our pay grade.
Right.
And I think Rav Soloveitchik felt that very, very cogently. So in a piece he wrote called A Halachic Response to Pain and Suffering, it's published in the early 90s, although I think it was delivered in the 60s as a talk. He said, Judaism doesn't have a metaphysics of evil, it has an ethics of evil. And what he meant by that is a metaphysics of evil would be a complete explanation as to why bad things happen, as to what makes God's justice just, right? Is God not a just judge? And metaphysics of evil would explain to us how it is that God is just. And Soloveitchik says Judaism doesn't have one.
Don't have it.
It has an ethics of evil, which it says God tells us how to respond to evil when we see it. And I see that, but I also see Nachmanides against it. If I understand it, it's a machloket between Rabbi Meir, and I can't remember the Tanakama in this Gemara. It's also Gemara in Masechet Brachot. I think it's Rabbi Elazar, says that Moshe Rabbeinu asked 3 questions of Hashem, and he received an answer to all 3 of them. The first was that Hashem should accompany us, and Hashem said, "Okay, I will." The second was that it should be exclusive, this relationship, and Hashem said it'll be exclusive. And the third is, I want you to explain to me, Tzadik V'Ralo, why is it that good people suffer? And according to Rabbi Elazar, Moshe Rabbeinu received an answer to all 3 questions. And according to Rabbi Meir, no, he received an answer to the first 2 questions and not the third. Because the third question, the question of why do bad things happen to good people is above our pay grades. I say this because I recognize that not every thinking Jewish voice in our tradition endorses what I along with Ramban, take to be an important endeavor, the endeavor of trying to at least hypothesize as to how the evil and suffering we see around us is consistent with God's justice.
Yeah, well, I will say on that a few things. I think that for presenting those points, I think that for me, when it comes to these things, I don't see, and I'm not saying that you're using the term, emphatically, but for me, machloket, it's less machloket and more revealing various parts of the tapestry, right? So what Rav Soloveitchik is talking about is a really important point, because what Rav Soloveitchik is saying is, okay, so, when you have a pandemic, for example, right, the more productive way to go about it is not to say, what have we done to deserve this? Yes. But to say, what does this mean to us, and how do we respond? How do we get out of it in the best way, right? And that's a very important point, because it's something that all of us have to deal with in the face of suffering and upset, because we can theoretically get lost in the question of why is this happening to me? Yeah, which we see. I mean, I'll say also as a rabbi and counselor in whatever capacity, oftentimes people get very stuck in that question.
Yes.
And it paralyzes the ability to be able to say, and now that it is, what do I do?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's that point, but what the Ramban is saying is we should not live a life in which God and his ways are so foreign and absurd to us that we lose our connection, right, to it. So there's a value to intellect, and there's a value to our sechel, and as the Rambam will say, right, that's our connection. Yeah. The very fact that we have consciousness and intellect is our way to get there, to connect with God, right? So the way that I look at it are these, again, there are these. This is a complex ball, right? Of that has so many permutations, and we're what we're trying to do to be able to kind of have some framework for it is to be able to look at the brilliance of those who spoke on it, and kind of try and put things together. And unless we absolutely can't, right? Again, that's what I'm saying.
Yes.
We're looking to see, well, how do we shed light on all of this and be able to say, well, in these circumstances, this is the way that we look at it. So I think so that's one thing that I'll put forward. But the other is I do think, and as I know your Hasidic streak, my staunch connection to the Rambam. And I really do think, because of that it is a mistake we make not to include the randomness of it all into the equation. Right? And not only that, but why the randomness? In other words, it's okay. It's one thing to say, well, let's just deal with the fact that randomness is all part of this, right? But also the importance of the fact that randomness is all part of it, and what we lose, the chances that we lose when we lose chance.
Yes, you need to explain if you take that route, and I'm not opposed to the route that gives real space to the existence of randomness within God's world. You need to explain how that could be just as well. Right? How is that compatible with God's justice?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Now,
absolutely.
But to respond to your first point, and I really appreciate this, and I think this comes from, I don't want to be sycophantic. I think it comes from your great wisdom, but I think it also comes from being a leader of communities, Rabbi Dweck, is that you recognize that for each phenomenon there's a season, right? Like in Sefer Kohelet, there's a time for thinking abstractly about the problem of evil. And that's when we come up with theodicies, the punitive theodicy, the soul-making theodicy is the name of the other thing we were talking about. John Hick says, you shouldn't judge the world in terms of how comfortable it is for God's creatures. That makes God sound like he's a pet owner and we're his pets, and how comfortable has he made the universe. You should judge the world by how conducive it is to soul-making, how conducive it is to experiences that are going to make us grow in the service of God and become true reflections of. However, there's a time for thinking abstractly about the problem of evil. There's a time for adopting the more Soloveitchikian response, and I think leading people religiously, part of it is about understanding when. That's right. At what time is what. And
so I will say a personal confession that has certainly come with age. Right, when I was younger, it was much more cerebral. But I also hadn't lived life or experienced my own level of pain and suffering to that degree, right? So that's I think that goes with the age process as well, but it is part of mentorship, right? I think it is important. I mean, I guess I'll say parenthetically over here, because you're bringing in the pastoral side of rabbinics or the counseling side of rabbinics. That is an important thing for mentors to teach apprentices in rabbinic training, because obviously, one can never replace what it is that life teaches us, right? Which goes into the core of our discussion, of course.
Yes.
But one can alert one to the fact that there is this phenomenon, right? And that there are things that we will not feel or see until we feel or see them, but we can be sensitive to the fact that they might be present.
And then I think you could add a further stage, which is there are times where we need to be able to live with a certain cognitive dissonance, applying what seem to be incompatible answers to the same problem simultaneously. Yes. This I take from Rabbi Akiva in his discussion with Tinius Rufus on this question. Tinius Rufus says, well, let me give you a moshel. If the poor are like...
You said, well, this is in response to a question of Tinius Rufus, why doesn't God feed the poor? Right?
That's right. If God wanted you to feed the poor, he wouldn't have made them poor, right? The fact that God made them poor means he doesn't want them being fed. So what are you doing feeding them? And he gives them a mashal. He said it's like a king who punishes a subject, and then along you come and undo the pain and suffering of the punishment. The king's going to be furious with you. Says Rabbi Akiva. I mean, the discussion goes further than this, but I like to stop and meditate on this point of this nakudah of the discussion. Rabbi Akiva says, no, hold on, let me give you a different metaphor. I think it's such a profound metaphor, and it says so much about Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva, of course, is the author of Avinu Malkeinu.
Yes.
Okay, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Rabbi Akiva says, no, it's not like a king punishing a subject and then you coming along and undoing the punishment. Because God is our king, but he's also our father, Avinu Malkeinu. It's like a king who's punishing a child. If a stranger walks by, I'm trying to imagine my highly strung 8-year-old put into timeout, right? I'm furious with him. Stand over there, Moshe Akiva, you're in timeout, right? And then someone walks by and can't help being moved by how cute he is, and gives him a candy or something. Well, I'm angry with him because he's done something that's worthy of being put in timeout for. I love him because he's my son, and anybody who can see how cute he is and share that with me instantly has an intimacy with me too. And says Rabbi Akiva, Tinius Rufus, what you're unable to do is work with more than one metaphor at a time. You're thinking of God as either he's the king or he's the father. He can't be both at once. Right. And this is eventually that's what Tinius Rufus pushes back on Rabbi Akiva. And I think Rabbi Akiva in the end, he wants to get out of the discussion and basically says, well, there's a pasuk that says we need to give charity, and that's why I do it. And go away.
That's very similar, right? Exactly. But first, finish your
but I actually think that had Rabbi Akiva had more patience with it, he'd have said, no, it's not either or. Sometimes he's our king and sometimes it's both. Right. And we have loads of different metaphors to describe the divine human relationship, but they are merely metaphors. And a sophisticated person can do two things. One, switch between them when appropriate and knowing when it's appropriate. But two is sometimes to be able to hold more than one of them at once. Yes. Right? And recognize the complex logic that governs the relationship between.
I think it's a beautiful point. I think that's an excellent point. Not that you need to say so, but I think it's wonderful. And it goes back to the fact that this is a complex ball, right? And there are going to be various parts of it. And even when Rabbi Akiva ends with there's a pasuk, it's essentially Rabbi Akiva saying Gzrat HaKatuv, right? Which is very much like God saying, right? This is the way that it is.
Just do it.
And so it's very interesting because that's what that line, right? That response is what Dawkins will reject. In other words, that line is what the atheists will reject. They'll say, no. There's no reason for us to have to get to that point in which we say kachala birtzoni. And I think that it's important for us to highlight, I think, again, to suggest that why should that not be a meaningful answer in and of itself, that there is humility and even reason to be able to say that we cannot wrap our heads around all of it, and that there are certain existential realities that are hurtful, that are painful, that are just not easy for us to be able to manage and accommodate. We live on a hostile planet. It is hostile. This universe is hostile to life. The reality is that we are, moving against the powerful move of entropy in order for us to be able to just carry on another day. Mm-hmm. And that is in the water. And for us to be able to say, Kachala birsoni, or that's the Gzerat HaKatuv, is not a cop-out. It is a recognition of the fact that these things are of, like we were saying at the beginning, these are the big questions that we may not be able to always hold in pristine clarity within our minds. So I wonder if I could, and I'm not saying that we have to end on this, but on that, I would like to read something. I actually brought a reading with me that I'm going to share with everybody, because for me, this is written by one of my favorite authors and a good friend of mine, Mark Helprin, who wrote a very a best-selling book in the 80s called Winter's Tale, not Shakespeare.
Not the Shakespeare one. Yeah.
Not those. And I was so moved by the way that he put this into the narrative of this. There's this young criminal, basically, who is working on discovering himself. Yeah, he's called Peter Lake. And he goes to this, very, very wealthy media mogul his name is Isaac Penn. And he falls in love with Isaac Penn's daughter. And she's suffering from consumption, right? She's terrible, and she's going to die. And so this Peter Lake asks Isaac Penn, he says, there's no justice in this. And so I'm going to read to you the response of it, because I think that for me, this is a very eloquent way of kind of pointing out what this last point that we're talking about. So he says, "Who said," lashed out Isaac Penn, "that you, a man, can always perceive justice? Who said that justice is what you imagine? Can you be sure that you know it when you see it? That you'll live long enough to recognize the decisive thunder of its occurrence? That it can be manifest within a generation, within 10 generations, within the entire span of human existence? What you're talking about is common sense, not justice. Justice is higher and not as easy to understand until it presents itself in unmistakable splendor. The design of which I speak is far above our understanding, but we can sometimes feel its presence. No choreographer, no architect, engineer, or painter could plan more thoroughly and subtly. Every action and every scene has its purpose, and the less power one has, the closer he is to great waves that sweep through all things, patiently preparing them for the approach of a future signified not by simple human equity, a child could think of that, but by luminous and surprising connections that we have not imagined, by illustrations terrifying and benevolent, a golden age that will show not what we wish, but some bare, awkward truth upon which rests everything that ever was and everything that ever will be. There is justice in the world, Peter Lake, but it cannot be had without mystery. We try to bring it about without knowing exactly what it is and only to touch upon it. So there's a bit of poetry in it, obviously, but something nonetheless that I thought is worth sharing.
So a couple of thoughts that might round out what I've been trying to say, and partly in response to that beautiful quote, Rabbi Dweck. So first of all, we've touched on some things called theodicies, responses to the problem of evil, the punitive one, the soul-making one, and there are many more. And people who come to my class, I think it's in September, if they become members of the Chabura, they'll learn about more. And they'll see them, please God, sourced in the Jewish texts, in the tradition. Something that comes out of the text you just read is there's a school of thought today among philosophers of religion called skeptical theism. And the skepticism here isn't skepticism about the existence of God. No, they're theists without skepticism. They're skeptical about our ability to understand God's ways. And the idea is that the very claim that a perfect being exists entails that there will be some things in the ways in which that being operates that will be beyond us. And therefore we should have a certain humility. But the beautiful thing I think about that quote is even if we can't necessarily understand it, we can sometimes catch a glimpse of it.
Sense it, yeah.
And I think that might be what's going on when God speaks to Eov from the whirlwind. There are two things going on. One is God is making clear to Eov, you can't really understand me.
I was going to say about that, sorry to interject, but there's this one line, right, where God says to Eov,
yeah.
Where were you when I made all of this? You weren't there when I was setting all this up.
Yeah, you think you understand this?
Yeah.
On the other side, and it took a Catholic commentator on the book called Eleanor Stump to make me see this, that it's not just accusatory language that God has, like, where were you? Where were you? God's making it clear, I'm there to look after every single animal in the whole of the cosmos, right? I care about everything. And what Eov learns is that even if he can't understand, he has an experience of God's care. So he catches that glimpse. The quote, who was it that you were reading?
This is Mark Halperin, an excerpt from his book.
Mark Halperin. So, but finally, something else you had said before you read the quote is about when is it acceptable to say, look, I just don't know. This is for me a great hobby horse, right? Because I think this is one of the great differences between the theist today and the atheist today. The atheist today, in a sense, I think, that's the Winter's Tale, Mark, thank you. So for me, one way of explaining the debate is as follows. The atheist believes that the world emerged by chance, and they can calculate even the chances that a universe would be hospitable to life, because you need the constants of physics to be within, a certain range, and the odds are ridiculous. Leonard Susskind, an atheist physicist, of course he's Jewish, because all the best atheists are Jewish.
But they're Jewish atheists.
But Leonard Susskind says you can calculate it about the odds of a universe being hospitable to life, about 1 in a trillion. And then you ask, okay, so why did that happen? That's fluke. What explain, the job of science is to explain things, right? And if a scientist says, oh, it happened by fluke, that's a cop-out answer. That's not, science is about reducing mystery and reducing fluke. They just say, oh, stam kacha, that's just the way it was. And in a sense, the theist says, no, we explain more by positing the existence of a God who wants life to evolve in this universe. So in a sense, our theory is more explanatory about, like you say in the Gemara, eina chanami, which means, how would you say that in English?
Nonetheless,
we also have to put our hands up at some point and say, also, there's stuff we can't explain. We can explain more than you, right? Because we believe the universe didn't get here by chance. So the theistic theory is more explanatory than an atheistic theory. Nonetheless, at every, your kids keep asking you, yeah, but why? Yeah, but why? Yeah, but why? And at some point, you just have to say, well, some things are, right? So everybody has to accept that at some point,
there are always axioms, right?
There are axioms.
You've got to start with axioms.
And and if the atheist wants to accuse us of a kind of intellectual dishonesty for not answering confidently why bad things happen to good people, I think there's a double standard here, because we've actually succeeded in being more explanatory than they have. Agreed. Sometimes we all have to put our hands up and say, I don't know. The question is, how far can you push that boundary back? And I shouldn't
wrestle with it.
You wrestle with it. And it's right. And I shouldn't conclude that our answer is we don't know, because there are some good theories to explain why at least some of the bad things
to explain components of it. Yes, of course.
Yeah. But there will be mystery too, and we're okay with that.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Reb Sam. I forgot I was fasting. It was amazing.
Oh, I'm so happy. It's
always
good. Out for you now.
Always a privilege and a tremendous joy to be able to talk with you. Thank you for taking your time so late at night there to speak with the Chabura and everyone who will be tuning in to listen to the recording. And the Yididi V'Habibi, please God, we should see each other in the flesh soon.
I look forward to it. For me, it's just a great opportunity, these Zoom conversations, to have a chat with you.
Thank you. When are you next in London? Are you planning or?
Well, I'm coming to visit my parents.
Okay.
Who there.
They're on, are they not?
That's right. Those Lebens is there.
Much nachat to you.
Thank you.
To your parents. Lovely to see them on.
Thank you very much.
When will you be here? When will you be here?
We're flying over at the beginning of August.
And how long are you staying?
We'll be around for a month, and we'll be in London for 2 days.
Let's try and get together at the end of August sometime if you're still in and not traveling.
I would love that.
Okay, I won't have to drag the entire audience into our diary planning.
All right. Thank you so much. Lovely to see you, Rabbi. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Over to you, Ohad. Are we done? Or we?
Thank you, Ohad.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Ohad, message Flora, please. Just see if you can help her out a little.
And I enjoyed the comments. I saw a great comment about Rabbi Sachs, Moreno Varadenu. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.